Good evening. My name is Joe Bielecki. I am the national president of the Sokol USA, also known as the Slovak Gymnastic Union Sokol. Sokol USA is a fraternal benefits society, and we have an interesting history, much different from most of the fraternal associations that you are familiar with. The Sokol movement started in Prague in 1862, and it spread all over Eastern Europe and Central Europe. It was started by a fellow named Miroslav Tirš, and Tirš was a professor of philosophy at Charles University in Prague. Tirš became interested in the Greco-Roman historical period and their philosophy, and he became interested in aesthetics. So he began to dig into the concept of a sound mind in a sound body. And that gave rise to his interest in sport and sport culture and merging philosophy and sport. And what does this have to do with a mutual benefit society? You will soon find out. So in 1862, Miroslav Tirš created the Sokol movement. And these are early Sokols in Prague. And the Sokol movement quickly caught on, first in the area that is now considered the Czech Republic, and then later it spread to, by 1863, it was in Slovenia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Poland, the Zakarpatska Ukraina, and Ukraine and Russia as well, and Bosnia, Montenegro, all of the Slavic countries. The non-Slavic people, such as the Hungarians, Romanians, and Germans, did not adopt this particular movement. Now you see the physical fitness component of Sokol in this picture. Large-scale mass calisthenics, and the focus became on what we would now call rhythmic gymnastics. It was open to all ages. It was open to men and women. Here you see women Sokols marching at a sport competition in the very, very early 1900s. And this was part of the whole movement. The idea that Tirš had was everyone of all ages and all body shapes and all sizes could participate in this. There was no differentiation according to wealth, social status. There was no religion whatsoever involved with this. You had, both in Europe, in the Sokol movement, and here in America, the Sokols were, at the very beginning, not affiliated with religion. And in fact, Sokol USA is completely a non-sectarian society. There is no differentiation. We accept everyone, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and we've had all of these religions personified in our national board of directors over time. It was completely non-sectarian because the idea was a sound mind in a sound body. And so religion had nothing to do with physical fitness. The whole Sokol movement became extremely popular throughout what we know as Eastern Europe today. And it became popular for a variety of reasons. First, the physical fitness movement. But secondly, with the passage of time, the direction of Sokol changed as well, as it attracted a larger and larger following of people. And you see this is from the All Sokol Sled, or it's sort of like the Sokol Olympic competition that are held every 6 years. This is from the 1920s, 1926. This stadium held 100,000 seats and it had a capacity of 26,000 in the field. And people did rhythmic gymnastics. You see the formation of lines, and they did this to music. At the beginning, before the advancement of audio technology, they usually, say in the 1800s, had very loud brass bands. By the 1920s, technology had advanced to the point where at Letna Stadium, they had put every 9 feet in the stadium floor speakers, so that the sound would carry at a uniform rate, and all the performers or the participants in these mass-scale rhythmic gymnastic calisthenic events could move in synchronization at the same time. So this, and you see some of the sporting patterns here in these photographs. Imagine 20,000 people at a stadium moving to music in such a fashion that you have these large designs being created by the participants themselves. Sort of like if you're watching college football and you see the Ohio State marching band and they march around, and you even see them spell in script the word Ohio. This is the kind of thing the Sokol movement was doing. The very first mass-scale calisthenics event was in the 1880s. And every 6 years, they had large events that rolled out. They called them sleds. A sled is, the Sokol, the word Sokol means falcon. And a falcon is a strong, free bird. And that was why this image was chosen. And in time, Sokol morphed from being a fitness society to the Habsburg Empire was a multinational state with the Austrians and the Hungarians in control of many millions of smaller nations. And many of these smaller nations didn't want to be part of this empire. They were kind of stuck there. And the early creation of Sokol was for aesthetics and exercise, physical fitness, the training of the mind and the body. But as nationalism in Eastern Europe increased with the passage of time, it carried over into the Sokol movement. Here you see, you see this woman on a stage at one of these large-scale events in the late 1800s. They began to adopt symbols. For example, and these symbols became quasi-political. Like this woman here in this image, she looks like a goddess. She comes from ancient Slavic history. Her name is Labusha, and she is always seen as this, the woman. She was like a sorceress in the ancient prehistoric times in what's now Prague. And people would come to her for advice. And the very first of the Czech kings appeared to her. And she saw him and she went into a trance. And she said, Przemysl, I see in the future a great city with an enormous castle on a hill. And you will create this city, and it will be called Prague. And so this is the goddess, the sorceress, the seer, Libusha. And she first arrived in Sokol, in the Sokol pantheon of images by 1901. She is associated with them. The falcon is the Sokol symbol here. You see it on the right-hand side. But Libusha, everyone, you don't even have to say who is this figure, because everybody in that time knew. She was the one who predicted the great city of Prague, the great power of the kingdom that would rise. And it became a very powerful kingdom until it was absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. And so as time passed, the Sokol morphed from being physical fitness into something quasi-political. They had hundreds of thousands of members all over the Habsburg Empire. For example, even today in the Czech Republic, they have 300,000 active members, and in Slovakia, it's 100,000 or more. But as the time passed, they even adopted slogans. For example, one of their slogans was Rovnost, volnost I bratrství, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. And it was very ironic because in the Habsburg Empire, you had an absolute monarchy, you weren't free, and there was no brotherhood. You had aristocrats and the people were in serfs until the 1860s. And what they did, they had a host of images that celebrated the idea, not just of physical culture, but of independence. They didn't come out and agitate for it per se, because they would be arrested and jailed. But they walked right up to the line. And the line was, they stopped and didn't openly say, let's be independent. But they knew that in the big picture, the Habsburg Empire would not survive. And they knew that the Russian Empire wouldn't survive. And they knew many of these areas in the Balkans would become independent. And so they became a training ground, in a sense, for democracy, as well as building not a real army per se, but a strong core of people who would become leaders after their countries were free. For example, in World War I, as the war was ending, the end of October 28th, is the Independence Day for the first Czechoslovak Republic. The Sokol seized the military garrison of the Habsburg Empire in the Czech land. The Habsburg army knew that the war was over. The influenza epidemic had reached Europe. Millions were dying to the Spanish influenza. Something like, in the big picture, something like 20% of the world's population died from Spanish influenza. The people in these countries were demoralized. The Habsburg soldiers all knew they were going to lose the war. At this time in 1918, they knew it was all done. It was just a question of when. The Russian front was advancing. And basically, a lot of these soldiers were just throwing down their weapons and going home. And so the Sokol in the Czech area of the first Czechoslovak Republic seized the garrison. Then you had 80,000 horsemen arm. They expelled the Habsburg army from the Czech land, and they marched into Slovakia and freed the Slovaks from the Hungarians. And this sounds so ironic. It's almost like the revolution of the gymnast. It sounds absolutely crazy, but that's exactly what happened. It was one of the most ignominious defeats of the Habsburg army and the Hungarian army in history. Now, it was easy to expel the Hungarian army from Slovakia because the Romanian army was advancing on Budapest, and everything was being focused on trying to push the Romanians out of Hungary. And the north was mountainous, where in Slovakia it was going to be impossible for them to defend it. So they in a sense, kind of didn't oppose this too strenuously. But the Sokol movement became really something heroic. And even to this day, in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, it is very esteemed. These are examples of Sokol calisthenics and rhythmic gymnastics. They used to send postcards out with all the routines portrayed in movements like this. And the postcards would also be printed with the musical scores so that you could imagine the music in your head, so that when you came to the stadium, you could join 20,000 other people and do this. So by the end of the First World War, the Sokols were something venerated in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the Slavic countries like Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Slovenia, because they freed their countries from the Habsburg Empire. And so this was something very, very unique that transpired. In the 1930s, there's even a different imagery, because by the 1930s, the Nazi fear was on the horizon. And they could see that Hitler was going to be coming. Hitler ultimately annexed the Sudetenland and overran the Czech Republic. And a puppet state was set up in Slovakia, a semi-fascist puppet state. And so the images of Sokol in the 30s were, they feared that this was coming. In the 20s, they celebrated independence with what they had done and what they had created. The 30s, they were trying to ward off the fascists from outside. So this is what Sokol was in Europe. Sokol was akin to one of the, in fact, they called them the pillars of Czechoslovak independence. Thomas Masaryk, the Czechoslovak Legionnaires, the Sokol, and the Pittsburgh Agreement, the four pillars of the foundation of the first Czechoslovak Republic, and one of them was Sokol. So what happens? How does this tie in with Sokol USA? Sokol USA is still an ongoing physical fitness and sports society. We still use the term brother and sister for our members. Everyone is equal. It is open to all ages, all physical shapes. If I stood up in front of this camera, you would see I'm kind of a portly 60-year-old guy, and they still take us in. And we still do these things. The younger people do the traditional sports. Okay? But Sokol came to America, and America was a whole different thing. And Sokol became a whole different thing in America. A lot of people were emigrating to the United States in the period 1880 to 1920. And what were these people? they were generally fairly young. Most of the emigres who came from Slovakia were generally between the ages of, say, 15 and 30 when they came. They were doing a great deal of physical labor here. They left very, very rural agrarian places because what happened was Slovakia was a primarily agricultural country. So you had people coming from this very, very rural agrarian society. Why did they come? The Slovaks came for mostly economic reasons. Other people emigrated here, for example, for political reasons or for nationalist reasons. That was not generally the case with the Slovaks. It was mostly an economic immigration. The Polish, for example, there was a term called the Kulturkampf, the Cultural War, and the Germans, who occupied 1/3 of the territory of what's now Poland, became engaged in an active campaign to make everyone in their empire German. The Russians, who had a big swath of territory in what used to be Eastern Poland, were doing the same thing. Many people were leaving because they wanted their language. They did not want to take on another culture. There was a small aspect of this after 1905 that happened in Slovakia, because at that time the Hungarian nationalism was rising. Slovakia had been ruled for 1,100 years by Hungary, and the Hungarians came late in the game to this idea of making everyone speak Hungarian who was in their country. But the emigration began really in the 1880s from Slovakia. It reached its peak in 1912, but it was largely an economic migration. Why? Because in the western part of Europe, in the early 1800s, you had the Napoleonic Wars. Then what happened? They devastated all of Europe. The French burnt Moscow, even. There was so much fighting that went on for years. So what happens? These villages, they're rebuilt. Their people are working. They're marginal. Like in Slovakia, it's really a marginal economic agricultural land. The part in the south that's flatter is more akin to grain production and things. In the north, it was mountainous. You had sheep. You had the herding of animals. It was a much different type of agriculture than what we see here, for example, in the United States. In the 1860s, the Americans had the Civil War. America and also Argentina, prior to that, were exporting grain to Europe in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, because Europe was devastated. The Americans had vast production of grain from Midwest, same with Argentina, and they became very wealthy from this trade. By the 1860s, the United States was out of the export market for quite a long time because of the Civil War. And so what happened was these marginal areas in Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, such as Slovakia and the mountainous parts of Zakarpatska Ukraine and parts of Romania, the peasants were becoming better off because they could raise crops, they could market their agricultural goods at better prices, And so their living standard improved for roughly a 10 to 15 year period. Sadly, America and Argentina come back from our civil war and everything. Like Argentina was cut off from exporting grains because the Union Army was actually patrolling the Atlantic Ocean and interrupting the trades with Europe of the South and everybody else. So the Slovaks became more prosperous. They had more children. And by 1880, these children were now in their late teens, early 20s, and there was not enough for them to do. They could not support themselves. Their villages were suddenly, due to these economic factors, going into poverty because they were overpopulated. The average immigrant from these regions, okay, we've said they're young. They're from agricultural regions. They were, by our standards today, poorly educated. Most people did not have, even in, say, 1912, most people did not have more than 3 years of elementary school. And there were, for example, there weren't 4 high schools in all of what is now Slovakia in 1912. 4. Think about your region at home. Look in your city. You have 20 or 30 high schools. In metropolitan Pittsburgh, I bet there's 100 and some high schools. There were 0 universities in all of Slovakia. The first university was built after World War I ended, and it was Kameneus University in Bratislava. So if you wanted to get a higher education, you had to leave Slovakia. So this is just to set the stage to see what the immigrants were like. And so you had these people who, by many standards, could barely read and write, third-grade education, and they're coming to Ellis Island. And they're coming here to very, very urban settings. For example, this is what they discovered in Pittsburgh in this similar time period. You had electrified streetcars. You had streetlights. You had a densely urban setting that they had never seen before. And this is what they encountered when they went to work. They were working in factories with highly mechanized equipment. You see this huge gear mechanism. This is in a steel factory in Pittsburgh. And you see the gentleman here who's working with it. These people, the scale, I mean, just the scale of this, it's incredible. This guy is the worker. And this is the equipment they're working with to produce steel. Most of them didn't speak other languages. And so when you came across from your ship landed in New York, you got off of Ellis Island, you went to the train station, and then the train took you for hours. Like the immigrant trains at the peak year of immigration in 1912 dropped 20,000 new people a day in the city of Pittsburgh alone. You can imagine how many thousands and thousands went to Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, etc., etc. This is one of many, many steel factories in Pittsburgh. And these factories were what soaked up these laborers. And this is why they were coming. There were jobs there. The Americans generally didn't want to do these jobs. They were terrible jobs. They were very labor intensive. They were poorly paid. They were very difficult labor. People often were injured. This is before the days of Social Security and workman's compensation. And if you got injured at work, you didn't have an income, and it was really a rough life. These people were leaving these impoverished villages, and they were willing to take these jobs and get a start. And imagine, they're speaking, nobody came knowing English. And they come and they're speaking like the Tower of Babel, in a sense, languages. Many of these factories had signs all over in Slovak, Polish, Hungarian, and several other languages, just so people could find their way around the factory, or if it was some dangerous area, they had the words like caution in all these languages, so they could at least be careful and not get injured. Another industry that people worked at were the coal mines. This is my grandparents' first home in the 1920s, early 1920s, near Latrobe, Pennsylvania, a little place called Jamison. And the people lived 2 families to a house. You see the outhouse building. You see, this is not the Ritz Hotel by any means. These were very difficult times. And the coal mine soaked up a great deal of immigrant labor too. They were very labor intensive. Much of this is digging of coal had to be done by hand at that time. There was not very highly mechanized. These guys were given these giant carts. The carts were on wheels, and there were tracks that were laid into the coal mine. And you took your cart, and your cart held 1,000 pounds of coal. And then when you filled it, they had horses that would pull the cart out through the mine, and that's how the production was. It wasn't like highly mechanized like today. So this is kind of the setting of the stage. Sokol had its life in Europe, but it came here. This is a wedding in coal mine area, Pennsylvania. In fact, the bride and the groom were my grandmother and grandfather. But you see the life these people had. This wedding was in 1913. People came, and as they stayed and had families, because it's the early emigration, 1880 to 1900, a lot of people stayed for a few years, made money, and returned home. And as time passed, people were staying longer periods. They were meeting, men were meeting women, getting married, and deciding they didn't want to return. They would raise their families here. Well, the Sokol movement came from Europe. It came very early on as well. The very first Slovak Sokol came in 1896. They formed their first lodge in New York City. And it covered a territory as far away as Bridgeport, Connecticut. By 1898, you had your first Sokol USA Women's Lodge. And by 1905, you had 90 lodges. And what did they do? They did sports, because people actually liked to do this. In Europe at this time period, they're using the Sokol sport movement as a front for agitating for independence. But here, it was different. Here, the people enjoyed this activity. They liked doing the sports. There was very little available for them, if you think about it. There was they were not from countries that participated in baseball or American football or things like that. But this was their own sports that they grew up with, and they liked it. And so Sokol spread all through the areas of Slovak immigration to America. You had, in 1905, they had 90 lodges under Sokol USA, 2,500 members. They were in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And these were, of course, the big areas of Slovak immigration. There was a quirky thing that happened also in 1905. Now remember, 1896, you have the first Slovak Sokol Lodge. By 1905, you had Slovak Catholics who wanted to have Catholic-only lodges. And the National Sokol USA Convention said no. From the beginning of the movement in 1862, it was open to everyone. And it is still open to everyone. And they showed the Slovak Catholics who wanted Catholic-only lodges, they showed them the door. And they became the Slovak Catholic Sokol, which is also a large fraternal benefit society. The brilliance of this movement, though, is really something interesting. If you think back to 1900 and this time period, there was no health insurance, there was no workman's comp, there was no welfare, there was no social security. If you died and you had a family, your family was out of luck. Often they were destitute. In fact, nationwide, there was a whole body of people who cleaned trains and train stations. These were generally widows. In these towns, they had train stations. That's kind of the job of cleaning trains and train stations was a job that was a quasi-charity job reserved for widows because there was no social security and there was nothing these people could fall back on. And so all of these immigrant era societies got a very brilliant idea. They formed large pools of life insurance. They sold their members life insurance policies. Why? Why would they come to Sokol USA and not go to MetLife or Prudential or some of these other large companies? Because these industrial labor jobs were considered ultra-hazardous activities. If you worked in a steel mill, generally MetLife in that era wouldn't sell you a policy. Metropolitan was like, no, you're likely to die and die young. The same with Prudential and the commercial companies. These jobs were considered ultra-hazardous activities, and they were not permitted to sell you life insurance. And so these people came together, and they were really clever. If you think about it, right? You saw the first generation in 1912 and what they looked like. Not very prosperous. Recently arrived in America. By the late 1920s, you see a whole different world. You can see they're more prosperous at their gatherings. The first American-born generation is here. They're still doing heavy labor and working in heavy industry, but they need the insurance because how do you maintain your lifestyle if your spouse who works in the factory or in the coal mine die? Everybody was afraid of being impoverished. And so this is from the 20s. This is here in the city of Pittsburgh. You see how people have scaled up their lives in one generation here in America. And so life insurance is something important because the death of the wage earner in the household was a devastating event. And so Sokol had a second prong with their activities. The pooling together of all this money and investing it generated income. And the income were used to support the sports lodges and to make possible facilities to pay for tournaments, to pay, it made participating in the sport possible, as well as ensuring the well-being of the Sokol family. And so it was, in a sense, from these people who came with a third grade education, is absolutely brilliant what they accomplished. They created halls, they created gyms, they kept their families from becoming destitute in the event of an industrial accident. And where you saw this happen was in 1918. It wasn't just industrial accidents. You had the killer influenza that circled around the globe, much like how the coronavirus is traveling around now, which thank God it's not as fatal as influenza was. But influenza, when it first appeared on the scene, killed many millions of people worldwide in a 3-year period. 1918 to 1920, 20% of the world's population died from influenza. It was an enormous, it just absolutely shocking thing. And the people who had these insurances, their families were safe because they at least had the money from the policies to avoid being destitute. It gave them time to figure out what to do after the wage earner was dead. It gave some security to the family of the deceased too. This was an era where women generally didn't work outside of the household. And so the fraternal benefit system was very, very vital to these people. There was nothing that guaranteed your economic security or your household security. And so the system that was created by these immigrants, and this is typical, Sokol wasn't the only one that did this. You had the Jednota, the First Catholic Slovak Union. You had the GCU, the Greek Catholic Union, the Polish National Alliance. They all did this to provide for the security of their members. What differentiates Sokol is we have the added effect of the sport. And the sports was really something. It was important too. And why? It gave people friendship and a worldview. They transported the sport participants. So for example, if you were a child in Braddock, Pennsylvania, or Bethlehem for that matter, or Bridgeport, Connecticut, or any number of industrial cities, their parents didn't have individually money to send them to compete by themselves or to another city by train or by bus to engage in sport. I met a woman who is still alive. She's now 94 years old. And she told me that when she was a young child in the factory city of Braddock, about 10 miles down the river from Pittsburgh, her father died young. And her mother had 5 children, and she was the youngest. The children, they had all belonged to the Sokol. And she said it was an amazing experience for her because Their family lived on the edge of poverty, but they participated in the Sokol sports and calisthenics and athletic movements. And it was thanks to Sokol. She could go to other cities with the group, like to compete in Detroit, compete in Cleveland. And you could see other cities. You could meet people from other cities, establish friendships. And so this was a very interesting plus that came from the Sokol sport movement being transplanted from Europe to America. We weren't agitating for independence over there. It was purely a type of sport people like to do. And the sport continued for a very, very long time. By 1926, they were filling Soldiers Field in Chicago with thousands of Sokol sport participants, just like they did in Prague. In 1938, they had 2,000 participants on the infield of the stadium, municipal stadium in Detroit. They had huge numbers here in Pittsburgh and in all these industrial cities. And it really was something important for the immigrant community. So the Mutual Benefit Society gave you full insurance to give you economic security, but the Sokol is an example of how it also enhanced your life through sport. They got in, as time passed, they got into other things as well. More fraternal activities. These days, what Sokol is doing, you have the traditional sports. I'm reaching here to kind of show you. You have the traditional sports, but this is from 2019 in Buffalo, New York. We had an international sports competition for the Sokols. Sokol does biking. They'd have walking clubs. Our walking event in Buffalo raised a few $1,000s, which we gave to the Special Olympics. We do many community activities. Our lodges raise funds for food banks. During the pandemic, our lodges raised $5,000 in March when the entire nation was shut down. Our lodges raised $5,000, which was given to first responder medical services and food banks in the communities where we have our lodges. And that's really a plus, because at that point in time, nobody knew how long things would go on. People were in great need, and this is the reason the fraternal benefit societies are important. They step forward and help their communities. It's not just about us as members. We do a lot of things in the community. And, one of our annual events, we box necessities for soldiers abroad and send them to our troops overseas. We raise money, which we give to Special Olympics and all sorts of other very nice charities. There are, for example, here in the Pittsburgh area, a group of ladies from Sokol who knit lap robes for soldiers, or former soldiers who are now confined to veterans hospitals. There was a year where they knitted 200 of these, and they were delivered to the VA hospital in Pittsburgh. It's touching, because this is the core of the fraternal society. And we started in a different way from the average fraternal society, which was sort of like selling insurance against the death. We started to raise money to make it possible for young adults and our members to play sports and to compete and to go from one city to another, to build lodge halls, with the sporting equipment. And it continues even now. We have roughly 5,000 members. Now, during another interesting phenomenon peculiar to Sokol is that in 1948, in the former Czechoslovakia, the communist government seized power and it banned Sokol completely. Sokol was completely banned, outlawed. Thousands and thousands of Sokol leaders were arrested and imprisoned because, of course, they knew the origins of Sokol. They were promoting democracy and independence, and they knew that that was antithetic to communism. During the Nazi occupation, the Nazis arrested many Sokol leaders and sent them to concentration camps in their deaths too. But Sokol was banned in the country where it arose from 1948 until 1989 and the fall of communism. The communist government tried to replace it with something called the Spartakiada, based on Greek mythology and the Spartacus, the slave revolt against the masters. It didn't work. People hated it. They didn't participate. They didn't like it. They all knew they were taking Sokol exercises and trying to give them a communist spin. But it was the Sokols abroad in the United States and Canada. Sokols even went to Argentina. They were in Italy, Paris, Australia, London, Scandinavia. The Sokols abroad brought back to the newly freed Czechoslovakia, free of communism, the whole movement. And it mushroomed instantly from being completely outlawed before 1989 to now having several 100,000 members by 1990. And they do an incredible scale of sports. The Sokols in Europe, and especially in the former Czechoslovakia, are like the YMCAs are here. They are big-scale sporting operations. For example, they have kayaking. They offer bicycle racing. They offer, of course, the traditional gymnastics, all kinds of sports. The Czech Olympic judo team was composed primarily of Sokol members. They're even doing that as sport. And it's a whole different thing, but we helped revive them in Czechoslovakia, and that is to our credit as well. And so when you wonder what is this fraternal society concept, this is what it's all about. It's people who come together to better their communities, to help each other, and to enhance each other's lives. And that is the really beautiful thing that came from Europe with Sokol, and the nice morphing of Sokol turning from a complete sports society to a sports and a mutual benefit society in America. And that's what it's all about. Helping the communities, helping each other, and still having fun while you're doing it. Thank you.